I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Lara Jones is an award-winning grit performance expert, keynote speaker, author, and creator of the Global G.R.I.T system. She's also the founder and CEO of two global businesses. Lara has worked with Fortune 100 companies, the U.S. military, celebrities, and executives to develop and enhance performance on multiple levels for leaders, teams, and entire organizations through her leadership and grit programs, workshops, and consultancy. Lara has been featured in numerous publications for her grit facing the loss of her youngest son and nearly her own life. As the renowned global grit girl, Lara has channeled her deep expertise and research into creating the Global G.R.I.T system that is unveiled in her book, Hunt or Be Hunted: How Anyone Can Develop Grit and Lead Like a Legend. We're going to talk about this book during our conversation today. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite a bit. I've been following Lara on social media. I'm elated she's here sharing her insights with us. Lara, welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast.
Mike, thank you so much for having me and for sharing your audience with me today.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. Well, you've got a great background, and the intro just skimmed the surface. So very quickly, what more do we need to know about Lara Jones personally and professionally? Just some additional insights.
Well, I think you covered a lot actually in that intro. It was an incredible intro. Thank you. But I think one of the biggest things, Mike, is everyone knows me as the grit performance expert. But here's the thing. I didn't actually want to become the expert in grit, right? It's something that is as a result of what I've been through in my life, which obviously we'll talk about, and obviously my past experiences and background and so forth and education. But I didn't actually want to be the author of Hunt or Be Hunted. I didn't even want to be the creator of the Global G.R.I.T system or the creator of the Grit Type Indicator. But I am, and I discovered an incredible system that helped me through a very tough time when I had severe adversity hit. And here's the thing. Adversity will hit you whether you think it will or won't, right? So grit, I always say you've got to choose your grit versus the grit that chooses you. In other words, be prepared. And if you're prepared for when grit comes knocking for you, because it will, then how much better are you going to be and shorter time frame in order to grit through something? And I'm not just talking about something severe in your life. I'm talking about it could be something in your job. It could be it's a role as a leader. It could be with your team. There could be conflict that's happening. People often talk about culture in business, but actually it's not just making sure that the culture within the organization is solid. You've got to look and say, where are my grit activated leaders, right? Because I'm on a mission to create the largest network of grit activated leaders. And it's something that I know we all have. We just have different levels of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Very profound words. Well, listen, somewhat related to that, I know you're out there. You've got a couple of different companies, consultancy and all that. So for the audience, I always try to frame up front, what does your companies actually do? Who are your clients and what problems do you help them solve?
I think that's a great question. Thank you, Mike. Well, the clients that I work with are Fortune 500 companies, but I have worked with smaller organizations. However, I've just discovered that there's actually a lot of issues when it comes to grit within teams and organizations, typically as you're growing, right? And companies, as they're growing pretty quickly, or maybe they've become stagnant in their growth. And it's as a result of not understanding how to activate the grit within each individual. And often what happens is people become burnt out because they think grit is a grind and the grind leads to burnout. But grit is not a grind, and grit does not lead to burnout. What leads to burnout is grit unchecked. So we have to check our grit. And I talk about that in my book, Hunt or Be Hunted, and happy to talk a little bit about that today. But I use something called the 5 pillars. However, within my clients, once they understand, so what I do is I obviously speak in front of audiences. I actually just came off the stage last week to a huge audience of 1,000 people, and that was for an influential women in energy conference. And so these were, and then there were men present as well. There was women and men who really want to understand that they've got to a certain level of success, but then to get to that next level, they become either stuck or they're a little fearful of something, or they're nervous of change. And it's about how do we activate that fear zone and break out of it to be able to get into our learning zone. And that's where GRIT, and my acronym of GRIT, which is get it done, reframe thinking, impact others, and take responsibility, really comes into play when we're talking about the 4 different zones, which is comfort, fear, learning, and growth. And so what I do, Mike, one of my favorite things to do is come into organizations and help them with my program. I have what's called a Global Grit program, and I'll come in, and it's over a specific period of time, and I will help them and their teams with specific areas of grit. And I go through the entire system. So I've got the 4 elements of grit, the 4 types of grit, and an entire process of how anyone can develop that grit, because companies will often give up on their employees if they feel that they're not grit activated enough, right? If they don't feel like they have that grit, and they think, well, grit is just, you're born with it, and it's innate, and therefore you either got it or you haven't. But here's the thing. That's not true. Yes, you are born, everybody is born with a level of grit, but it's what you do during that learning process, even as children, with how well developed that's going to be in your adulthood. Now, if you are in your adulthood and you feel like you don't have that level of grit that maybe somebody else has, that just comes down to a belief, right? And so you've really, and you've got to put yourself in the correct environment in order to have the autonomy to learn in the way that you want to. When you do that, that's what leads to the belief. And when you have belief, it gives you the motivation. When you have motivation, that influences how you think. And when you influence your own cognition, that's when you alter your brain processes, and you're literally rewiring the brain. When that happens, that is when we're able to adopt a growth mindset, which is what you need in order to adopt the very thing that you're trying to learn in the first place. And in this case, it would be the Global Grit system. So one of my favorite things to do is obviously teach that entire system within organizations through my Global Grit program. And I also carry out workshops. Sometimes they're one-off, sometimes they're, a series of workshops, and I do it virtually and in person. And obviously Keynote Speak, travel throughout the country. And I have had companies also hire me on as a consultant to help them in their times of need, or to get them through a transition period, which I see pretty often. They're facing change and they need that help with transitioning their team members, or even trying to recruit team members that are very gritty, right? They're trying to look for that grit level. And that's what my grit type indicator does, similar to a DISC assessment, but in grit.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it's just taken off like a storm. It's just incredible.
No, I love it. It's very interesting. By the way, I've not read your book yet. We're going to talk about it, but I can't wait to get it. I've read book summaries of it, watched you on some podcasts. It's fascinating stuff. And clearly you're passionate about it, which I love, to see that kind of fire coming out of you. Well, you deal with so many leaders. I always ask up front, if somebody pressed you and said, Lara, what is your philosophy of leadership? In a nutshell, executive summary, in one breath. What's your philosophy? What's Lara Jones' philosophy of leadership?
I'm just going to have one word for it. You know what that one word is? Grit, right? Because as a leader, if you don't have the grit that you need to push through the hard times, to push past the uncomfortable, to do the things, to do the hard things when it matters most, then if you don't have that, if you don't have the grit to do that, then what example are you giving the team, right? So we have to have that grit within us. We have to know how to activate that grit as a leader, because it's not about you, it's about others. And that's what many leaders, I think there's a lot of leaders out there that do understand that, but there are many that maybe don't. And so they think they put all this pressure on themselves, like they have to be the best at something, they have to set the example, and so forth and so forth. Here's the thing, you can't be the best at everything. So when you're a leader, you are now in a position where you have others that look up to you, that respect you, But they only have that respect if you are authentic and they have trust with you. So when you show your grit, that really does show the authenticity of somebody, because that just, it's like peeling back an onion. You're revealing all the different layers and suddenly you're exposed and you're being vulnerable. And I think as a leader, as a leader, we should be vulnerable and have the courage to do so. So it creates that authenticity and builds the trust with the team. And how do we do that? By activating our grit. And grit isn't just a word that's like for macho people, right? Just push, push, push. And yes, you do need an element of that. That's the G in my grit, called the get it done. But the other elements, the reframe thinking, the impact others, the take responsibility. Grit is leadership. You cannot be a leader without grit, because most leadership programs will fail because they're focused on you and the other person. But leadership isn't just about interpersonal communication. It's about getting it done, reframing how you think, impacting others, and taking responsibility. And what does that spell? Grit. So grit is leadership. You can't be a leader without grit.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's get into your book. I am fascinated by it, and obviously it's a topic you know well. You wrote it. So again, the book is titled "Hunt or Be Hunted: How Anyone Can Develop Grit and Lead Like a Legend." And I think you kind of already implied this answer, but I always ask the authors of books, why did you write the book, and what audience is it aimed at?
So I wrote the book because I discovered a system. I discovered something so profound at the worst point in my life. And I'll share with the audience why this came about and what that worst point in my life was. So in 2021, my youngest son passed away and I nearly lost my life. And as a result of that incredible tragedy, I realized something, that I've always been a go-getter, right? I've always been somebody that can just pick myself back up. I mean, I came to this country 8 years ago with nothing, I had no money. I had no social security. I had nothing, right? And no home, no car. And yet I was able to build what I've built today from nothing. But I was able to use a lot of my G for my grit, right? I was able to get it done. I was able to be a go-getter. I could brush myself back off again. If I had a setback, I would just use it as a comeback. I would just keep going and going and going and going. However, when my son passed away and I had to face the reality that I was going to live the rest of my life without my sweet baby boy, Jack is his name, and I had to make the heart-wrenching decision as to whether I was going to have him buried or cremated, which no mother ever wants to face. No father either. No parent ever wants to face that. But when I had to make that heartbreaking decision and the reality just sunk in, I kind of went into this dark hole. I went into a dark hole for quite a few months. It was about 4 months. And I will never forget this. It was actually on a Monday and it was in January and it was 2022. And I remember waking up one day, staring at myself in the mirror. And I said, you got to wake up today, Lara. Your son did not. You got to feel the sun on your skin today. Your son does not. Stop making this about you. This is about others. What are you going to do with what you've gone through to use it as a fuel to now help empower so many other people that feel stuck in their life? Maybe they feel stuck in their job. Maybe they feel stuck in their marriage. Maybe they feel stuck with not knowing how to let this person go. Maybe they just feel stuck in so many areas of their life, both in the workplace and personally. And I looked back and I kind of reverse engineered what I'd been through in my life and thought, okay, because I've gone through several traumas in my life in England. And you can read about that in the book. I talk about it in chapter 2 of the book. But while I was going through this change of this, what I call transformation, the old Lara versus who I've become, which was, I sunk into this deep hole. And I thought, I can't continue living like this. I have to pull myself out, because at the end of the day, like I had another company, and I haven't even spoken about that other company, but it's actually a marketing company that I don't, I've got an incredible team for, but they had families they had to feed. And so I felt this tremendous weight on my shoulders and responsibility that I had to help those people. I had to help my living children. I had a husband. I have a husband, right? And so therefore, I had so much pressure put on my shoulders. And yet here I was, a grieving mother that I really felt didn't have or wasn't able to be given the time to grieve because I had to get on with it. But here's the mistake that people make. If you don't stop and pause for a moment and think, if I take this action or even inaction, how is that going to impact the people around me? And that's what really made the difference. And in that moment, I realized, oh my gosh, I can't be the G in my grit. I have to be the R in my grit. And that was reframe thinking. So I stopped saying to myself, look what happened to me. I would say, look what revealed me. Instead of saying, look what was taken from me, I would say, look what was given to me. And it's interesting when you just flip one word in that sentence and it changes everything. Like, I actually want the audience to try this as you're saying this to yourself, look what happened to me this morning, or look what happened today, or I've had a bad day. If you flip that and say, look what revealed me today, I've had an interesting day, right? When you change that language, a physiological response happens within your body, and your body and your brain are connected. That's what I talk about with the 5 pillars, about making sure that you don't burn out using the grit, but they're very connected. And so when you have that physiological response, it's sending signals to your brain that, oh, this is okay now. I can think about this in a different way. And so that R in my grit is so important, because that is what's going to get you out of the fear zone and get you into the learning zone. And that's where the innovation happens. And so that's how and why I discovered the system and why I wrote the book, because I felt like it needed to be shared with everybody. I thought that I cannot be selfish with this. Now I felt like I had this growing need. And I thought, wow, if I could create the largest network of grit activated leaders through my global grit system, I have to share this. And so I just had this burning desire that I had to write the book to get it out to the masses.
Yeah, I love it. Well, just to clarify with the audience, grit is a word that is out there in society, corporate America, in print, social media. And I think, when you show somebody an apple, they usually say it's an apple. But when you say the word grit, I think there's great room for misinterpretation. So the question I have, so I want you to define grit, but is grit, when I looked at it, does she mean grit is the same thing as resilience or mental toughness or dedication or any other word that could kind of be bolted onto there? So let's clarify that with the audience. When you say grit, somebody has grit, what does that mean?
I love that you asked that, Mike. That is one of my favorite questions to answer. So there is so much more to grit than what people realize. I mentioned earlier that when people think of grit, many think of like macho men, and you have to like push through, and like you see, I've got pictures of me pushing heavy sleds because obviously I'm an athlete and competitive athlete, and like that's a lot of the stuff I do. And also I'm married to a Marine. So you think, oh yeah, the military, the Marines, like everyone is so tough and they have that grit. Well, there's also studies out there that show that something is like a task is more likely to be finished with somebody with grit versus talent. And so that's very interesting. And so the word grit itself, it was defined, 10 years ago as grit being someone with passion and perseverance, but I think it's so much more than that. It's so much more than that. It's really about, like I mentioned earlier, getting it done. It's reframing how you think about a situation. It's when you do something, how are you impacting somebody else, right? And do you take responsibility? Are you taking ownership of your actions or inactions? Because when you think of a tough situation, something's thrown at you, again, whether it's in the workplace or perhaps you've had something, maybe you've had a bad quarter, right? Within the company, maybe you've had a bad quarter, and you think, well, I could just give up on this, or I could fire a load of people, or I could just hire new people, or how do I get through this? Well, I have something called Grit Through It. It's actually part of my program, and it's the acronym GRIT, but it's Grit Through It. And that's where I teach what grit really is all about. And like I mentioned, everybody has a level of grit, but you can't access just one type of grit and expect yourself to get through something. Like I mentioned, when my son passed away, if I had just used the G in my grit, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't be sitting in front of you right now doing this podcast with you, because the G in grit is necessary, right? It's about getting it done and taking action. But sometimes our brains just cannot push through something where it's trying to protect you. And so that's where we have to teach our brains a new path, which is all about the reframe thinking. So grit to me is really a set of 4 elements. And it's to get it done, reframe thinking, impact others, and take responsibility. And you really have to learn how to harness all 4 of those areas to have what I call true grit. If you don't harness all 4 areas and you just think you can just mutter your way through things, it can lead to burnout. And so we have to be strategic in how we manage that grit and which part of grit we need to activate in that very moment. And how do we recognize it? That's another thing. So as leaders, we have to teach our teams that. We have to show our teams, how do we activate the very level of grit that we need from you in that moment? So I could go on about this. It's a fascinating topic to me.
Well, it is. And the natural segue to that, to what you just said, which I truly appreciate, is, I know you've developed what you trademarked as the Global Grit system.
Yes.
And it's a step-by-step guide to instilling grit in your daily life and leading others to do the same. So let's get into that. Can you share a little bit of insights deeper on the Global Grit system?
Yeah. So, this is something I share, obviously, when I come in and do a program with organizations. But the Global Grit system really is made up of the 4 elements of grit. And then you've got the 4 types of grit, which is where my grit type indicator comes in. So as part of the system, you take an assessment, which shows you which level of grit you actually are. Basically, are you the G, the R, the I, or the T? Like, where do you fall within that? And it's not a personality assessment. This is not a personality assessment. This is about understanding how you react in situations when adversity hits. Because as human beings, our emotions will take control in most cases. Like, that's the initial reaction, because the emotion is the oldest part of our brain. And therefore, when something happens, we react emotionally. It's why we might snap at our partner sometimes. It's why we might yell at our kids sometimes. It's why we might, honk the horn if someone annoys us, like when we're driving. It's an emotional reaction. And so what I do is, I want to understand, first of all, where do you fall on that grit type indicator? Are you the G, the R, the I, or the T? And then what I do is I help teach all the other levels of grit, the other areas, and also help identify to that specific individual, the team of leaders. I help them identify how other people are seeing them. So it's not just about them, it's about how other people are seeing them, and then how they can communicate in a way, in a adversity type situation. How can they communicate with that individual or with that leader or with that team that's going to create the calm that they need to be able to push through and push past the uncomfortable. So when we have an emotional reaction, it is incredibly important that we understand that we are having an emotional reaction. How do we manage it in that situation? How do we bring the logic back into it? Because obviously, we can activate both sides of our brain. How do we bring the logic back into it? And I'm doing this because I always like to refer to your hand as like a brain. And so for those that are listening and can't see me, I'm actually folding my thumb into my palm of my hand and putting my 4 fingers over the thumb. And if you imagine, your thumb is the emotional part of the brain and the 4 fingers are the logical part. And so when we have a reaction to, a situation that requires, it shocks us, or we kind of go into that fight or flight mode, right? Which is what happens. Often the emotional part will just kind of break through and push the 4 fingers that I'm demonstrating here, or push the 4 fingers, which is the logical part of the brain, up. And so as it's doing that, we have to learn, how do we bring those 4 fingers to pull that thumb back into the palm of our hand? And obviously this is just an analogy, but I'm talking about with the brain. How do we control the logical part to bring back the emotional part of the brain and tell the brain, it's okay because I have a tool to get me through this particular moment. And I'm going to reach into that tool bag and apply it. And I'm able now to approach this situation in a way that my team can understand, that others that are not part of this team, but maybe on another department of the company, they can see what's going on. And we're able to not just react, but we're able to prepare for any other type of adversity that might hit us.
Yeah, thank you. I know you've already touched on this and implied it. I'm not sure. So I believe that you identify two types of grit, chosen and imposed. I'm not sure you've referred to them as such yet on the podcast. So I'd like to touch on that. In fact, do you refer to grit as two types, chosen and imposed? What's the difference? Is one better than the other?
So what I like to talk to people about, and I often speak about this when I'm keynote speaking, but it's about the grit you choose versus the grit you don't. And what do I mean by that? Well, 8 years ago, when I left everything and came to this country, I chose that grit. I didn't have to do what I did, right? I was actually a very successful sales director. I'd helped grow businesses from the ground up into multi-million dollars and, well, pounds over there, but if we're referring to the US, it's dollars. And I helped in significant ways to develop teams as well. And so with my background in the business world and growing companies globally, not just over in the UK, but globally, I realized that there was other elements of my life that I wasn't happy with, right? There was just in my personal life, there was other elements I wasn't happy with. And I thought, well, I could continue on down this path doing what I'm doing, or I could actually create something of my own and really impact the people that I want to impact on the level that I want to impact. And I could only do that if I broke away from that and started out on my own. And so I decided to choose my grit. Like I had a really nice lifestyle over in the UK with something that I had built. I gave it all up. I'd locked money away. I'd moved over. I came with nothing, literally just a laptop in my brain. So I had no money, no social, no home, no car, didn't know where I was going to eat. And at one point, I didn't even eat for 3 days because it was a choice between a roof over my head or food. But I felt like this was so powerful. And I really wanted to show people, listen, you really can do anything you want to do if you put your mind to it. What do I mean by that? You've got to have the belief. Because there were people out there that started to lose faith or belief in me because I, had been out here for a number of months and it was a struggle. But I never stopped believing in myself. And so I continued on with that grit that I chose. Now, here's the thing. If I hadn't gone through those tough times, if I hadn't chosen that grit at that period of time in my life, then how I approached the situation when my son passed may have been very different, because I relied on some of the tools that I learned from that. I had to pull from that. I had to reframe how I thought about the situation, much like I did from 8 years ago. Every time, like when I couldn't eat, I thought, is this really worth it? Is what I'm doing really worth it? And I would snap out of it and say, absolutely, it's worth it. 100%. Because what's the alternative? You go back and you walk into something and then there's something that's easy. We don't do hard things in life or easy things in life because for just the sake of it. We do the hard things because it's the right thing. And that's how I felt in that moment. I thought, yes, this is hard, but if I don't go through hard times, if I don't choose the grit, then how am I going to be prepared for when grit chooses me again? Because it will, and it will come for all of us. And so when my son passed away and I nearly lost my life, I pulled from that. I pulled from that level of grit that I remembered about what I'd gone through prior. And I used some of that. In other words, the reframe thinking. I really pulled from, that part of my life.
Thank you. Clearly you're passionate about it, and I believe the listeners are like, okay, I want to develop grit. One thing I haven't asked, and it's a legit question from my perspective, is when you talk about choosing grit and developing grit, what kind of timeline are we talking about? Days, weeks, months, years? I mean, is this a long-term thing, an ongoing thing? I mean, how person has Mike Etor has his grit right now. And if you measured, I have a grit level. Can I improve it in a day, 300 days, 3 years? What's the time frames?
I love that question. I love that question as well. I've actually shown on stage live that I have activated someone's grit within a couple of minutes. So it's pretty incredible, right? It's very incredible. Grit is not linear. It is not a timeline per se. Grit can be developed in anybody. I mean, I've carried out extensive research on this. I mean, I've got over 200 studies and references within my book, Hana Behind It. I've got so many references to it that I know that grit can be developed in anybody. The length of time depends on the coach that you're actually working with. So, for example, I've made it happen within a couple of minutes, live on stage in front of hundreds of people, hundreds. I've had it as well where I've worked with teams, and it depends if I'm working with teams and I'm trying to show them their grit levels to each other and also activate them individually, and then to be able to work as a team. That can sometimes take a little longer because there's more work that I have to do there, right? There's a lot more work that I have to put in. But it really becomes dependent on who you're working with and how receptive you are to that person. And so again, my biggest thing when it comes to developing grit in anybody, we don't focus on how much money can that person make in that team as a result. That comes as a result of building the relationships with each other. When you build relationships, the time doesn't really matter because that will come. The money doesn't really matter because that will come. Because as you build up those relationships, you're building up the authenticity, you're building up the trust, you're building up that belief, that motivation. When you apply all of that, and I've got an entire process, it's part of my Global Grit system, is how I am able to do this. But when I apply my process from getting them to identify the 4 elements of grit with the 4 types of grit, and then we go through the process of how you develop each area and develop grit as a whole, that can be dependent again on the person you're working with and how receptive you are, how much trust you have in that person and with each other. So if I'm walking into an environment where I've got this culture of chaos, as I like to refer to it, and I'm trying to create a culture of excellence, then I have to start somewhere, right? And oftentimes I have to start with the leaders. I start with the leaders and it starts to trickle down into the remaining of the company. Now, I don't just work with leaders, right? I work with companies as a whole. I work with sales teams. I work with HR. I work with, in tech. I mean, you name it. I've pretty much worked with everybody and anybody. And you might think, well, they're so different. Is there not a specific method that I apply to each one of them? The thing is, here's the thing, the method and the process is the same, but how you apply it and how I approach it is dependent on who I'm dealing with. So how they think could be very different from how the other person thinks. So what I'm encoding could be very different to how the other person decodes it, and the person next to them could decode it in a completely different way. Do you see what I'm saying here? So
Yeah.
it's dependent on who they're working with and how receptive they are to the program and to actually wanting and applying the learning. They have to have a growth mindset to be able to do this. But in order to get to that growth mindset, I have to create the environment first. I have to walk them through that process that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you. Well, our time is coming to an end here, and I want to ask you a a question I ask everybody, every guest on the podcast. It's a non-grit specific question. You have worked for, trained, developed, mentored, observed so many leaders. Two-sided coin. Are there any traits and habits that you feel are possessed by the very best leaders? And then turn that coin over. Unfortunately, do you have a set of traits and habits and behaviors that are also pretty common with bad leaders, ineffective leaders? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that, Mike. There's actually 3 traits that I find in top leaders, but the number one in the top 1% of leaders is discipline. And discipline is grit. I'm so focused on discipline when I work with individuals. And here's the thing, discipline can sound scary. It can sound very scary to people because we have that negative connotation, because as kids, we heard the word discipline, you're in trouble for something, we have a negative connotation to the word. So we have to reframe how we think about it. So when I work with companies, I say, listen, if you want to instill discipline within your company culture, we can't refer to the word discipline, right? We have to refer to it as a company, a culture of excellence. We have to refer to it as a culture of excellence. And it means the same thing, because excellence does require discipline. It's about when you feel not like, if you have those moments where you wake up and you don't feel like doing something, you have to remember the discipline that you have in order to do it. And how do you have the discipline? Well, you've got to have a set of habits, right, that create the traits that give you the very discipline that you need. And so I walk people through that. But it's also about belief and about courage. Because if you don't believe in yourself, others aren't going to believe in you. So as a leader, as a top leader, you have to have the belief in yourself. You have to have the belief in others, and that others have the belief in you. And you have to have the courage to walk away from comfort. You have to have the courage to do the hard things when it matters most. But you have to have the discipline to push through and use the grit when you don't feel like doing it.
Yeah, well said. Love it. So let's turn the coin over. Unfortunately, they're out there, the ineffective, not necessarily bad people, but there are bad leaders out there. What are you seeing most of the bad ones have? Do they have any traits in common as well?
Yes, they do. They will make it about themselves and not about others. So they'll make it about their position and their title versus the impact that they're having on a team. I often can see leaders that want to lead because of the position that they're in, or the title, or the power that they have. They're not utilizing it in a way that could really empower the team. And that could be through fear, right? It could be through fear of, if I empower this other person in my team, well, then maybe they're going to become a better leader than I am, and I might be out of a job. Right. So it comes from a fear-based. And so when I have worked with individuals like that, and I break down like it's like an onion, right? You peel back the onion and you get to the core root of what's really causing that issue. Because I am an executive coach too. So obviously I do work with some of the top leaders across the country. And I've worked with some other leaders that have unfortunately felt stuck, right? They get stuck in this fear zone. And it's because they have this fear that if they use what they have inside of them to empower others, that they're going to be out of that job. And also they don't have the grit, right? And you've got to develop that grit. You've got to have it as a leader. And also, this is another thing, they don't take responsibility. So if you look at good leaders, they have the get it done, they have the reframe thinking, they have the impact others, they have the take responsibility. You look at poor leaders, they're not able to take action. They rely on somebody else to do it. They aren't able to reframe how they think. They just a fixed mindset, and they focus on one thing only. They're not impacting others, or they are, but they're impacting them in a negative way, not a positive way, because that can go two ways. And then they don't take responsibility. You often find that they will not take responsibility for their actions or their inactions. They will blame others. So it's very easy when you look at the GRIT system and look at the acronym that I created, you can clearly identify, do they have this? You know, do they have the get it done, reframe thinking, impact others in a positive way, and take responsibility? Tick, great. They're going to be a great grit activated leader. And if they don't have that, or if they're doing the complete opposite, then we've got work to do. And it's not to say that they can't get from here to here, right? Not to say they can't get from being a poor leader to being a really great leader. It's just that they need to learn how to activate that. They need to learn how to transition from that. And that's where you need to have an effective executive coach to be able to do that, to make that transition.
Yeah, excellent. Well, our time is done, unfortunately, Lara, but I can't let you out of here without asking you the fantasy question that I ask everybody at the end of the interviews. If you were able to bring back one leader from the past, or any leader for that matter, and spend a day with that leader, who would you choose, and why? Why would you choose that person?
You know, that's such a great question. I actually have three, if I'm able to share.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one of them, well, two of them are still alive. One of them has passed. One of them is Sir Richard Branson, who's still alive. And he is somebody that I have looked up to from when I was very young, because I followed everything that he said, which was, if you don't know how to do something, you say yes, you do it anyway, and you figure it out later. And because of that, that's how I came to America. That's how I was able to build what I built, because I didn't hesitate, and hesitation can kill. So I didn't hesitate because of Sir Richard Branson's philosophy in life and how he approached his work, his personal life, everything, right? So Sir Richard Branson, if ever he listens to this podcast, he's one of my heroes, right? I absolutely really respect and look up to him greatly. Another leader who's still alive is my old boss, who is the owner of a company that I helped grow over in England, and who saw something in me and gave me an opportunity to really show what I was capable of doing. And because of that opportunity, I have learned so much. His name is Brian, and he is an incredible leader. He's since sold the company, and I think he's off helping one of his children now with one of his businesses. But he is a tremendous leader, and I have so much to thank him for. And also, coincided with my old sales director as well when I was learning the business. His name's Paul. Both of them, Paul and Brian, fantastic leaders, and I have so much to owe them as a result of where I am today. The other one, the third one, probably the most important one to me, is somebody that nobody else on this podcast is going to know, but it was actually my grandmother. And I referred to her as Omi because she was German. And to me, she was one of the greatest leaders out there. And why? She went through such severe, tough times that nobody here today could even comprehend. Being German through the World War II, when you didn't want to be a part of that, and she was forced, it was just horrific. She had to escape, and she was able to escape, but the rest of her village were either, I mean, it's pretty horrific, but the rest of her village were either, raped or killed. And she was able to escape that. And she was even split from my grandfather for a couple of weeks. And she lived on berries and stream water in a forest. How she did that, and the resilience that she had, and the way that she just grit her way through that, she's a true hero to me. She's inspired me to remember to never, ever, ever give up. And she was able to meet back up with my grandfather after going through such a horrific experience. And it was really by chance that she even saw him again. He kind of came over the hill, and she saw him after 2 weeks of living in the forest. It was just an amazing story. And she's had to go through so many different types of adversity in her life. And she told me all of these different tales. And I tell you what, to me, was one of the greatest leaders, because why? She never gave up. She was able to get things done. She reframed how she thought about situations. She impacted so many people, so many. Everyone loved her. They referred to her as the lioness, which I now have a lot of people referring to me as that. And I think that's why I kind of took that on. I referred to myself as the baby cub to her. And now I feel like since she's passed, I've kind of stepped into her shoes. But she impacted so many people. And she always took responsibility of her actions, always. And she never let you get away with anything, right? She would always call you out on things. So to me, out of everybody, my grandmother was one of the greatest leaders that was ever born. And because of her, I love to refer to, with my business, I love to refer to myself as the lioness. Her favorite animal was the lion. And so that's why I've always kept my long hair, because I joke, I say it's my mane. But yes, she was a true inspiration.
Well, I can't top that. That's great. We're all blessed. Well, not all of us are blessed with someone like that in our life, but when you are blessed, lifelong impact. And clearly I could just see the passion, just dripping from you on that. So, well, listen, we're done, Lara. So how do people contact the lioness, and how do they find her book, and, how do they find out more about you? How do they reach you?
Well, thank you so much for asking. Well, my book is available on Amazon, and it's Amazon worldwide. So you just type in Hunt or Be Hunted, Lara Jones. There's no U, it's Lara. So it's Hunt or Be Hunted, Lara Jones, and the book will come up. So you can buy that off Amazon. And they can also visit my website, which is larajones.com. Again, Lara Jones, JONES.com, larajones.com, and that'll tell you a little bit more about me. I also have something that I would love to give away to the listeners today, if you wouldn't mind, Mike.
Sure.
But
Please.
I have something called the Grit Accountability Guide, and it just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview of those 4 elements of grit that I mentioned. And it's really a guide to kind of help navigate maybe some of the tough times that you might be going through, whether it's in work or personal. And so if you just text the word grit, G-R-I-T, just text the word grit to 33777. So that's grit, G-R-I-T. Text that word to the number 33777. And you will be able to download, it's completely free, but you'll be able to download your free Grit Accountability Guide. And that's just my gift to your listeners for tuning in today and listening to your podcast.
Excellent. Well, we'll make sure we put that in the details of the podcast. I can't thank you enough, Lara, for sharing your insights. It's been a fascinating discussion. And selfishly, I request that you consider coming back and doing another session someday.
I would absolutely love to, Mike. And thank you again. And thank you to all the listeners. And thank you for sharing your audience with me today, Mike. I truly appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Be well, Lara.
Thank you so much, Mike.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.